Now, I don't want to get too autobiographical. I don't think my personal experience with Ocarina of Time is especially interesting to anyone who isn't me. But I do think it's relevant to share a little bit of my own personal experience here. I was born in late 1996, making me either the latest kind of late millennial or the earliest of the Zoomers. Ocarina of Time occupies some of my earliest memories, but I wasn't exactly on the hype train awaiting its release. No. When I was a child, I was existing in the wake of Ocarina of Time's popularity. It was the game that blew my older cousins' mind when it was new, but had always existed as far as I was concerned. I didn't own the console it was originally released for, the Nintendo 64, when I was a child, but after a few years of seeing the neighbors' children play it, I finally got access to it myself when I got a GameCube for Christmas in 2003. That was the year that Nintendo, desperate to prop up the sales of its somewhat unsuccessful console, bundled new purchases of the GameCube with a disc containing 4 Legend of Zelda games. The first 2 games, released for the Nintendo Entertainment System, and the 2 games released on the Nintendo 64. That was how I was able to play Ocarina of Time originally. Anyway, a while ago, I was looking through some of my school assignments that my parents saved from when I was in 1st grade. As a child, I was already using my fledgling literacy to write about Ocarina of Time. As an adult, reading these old writing assignments was how I remembered that when I first played this game, I did the Fire Temple before the Forest Temple.
One of the strongest images of Ocarina of Time that had been etched in my mind, and indeed one of a few candidates for earliest memory I have, is the exterior of the Temple of Time after Link has become an adult. The dark, dreary background with the dying courtyard and soot-stained stonework is sharply contrasted against 2 things: Link with his gay little outfit and the angry red ring of smoke circling the top of Death Mountain off in the distance. So, when I was finally able to get to this scene myself, I never even considered listening to the mysterious handsome stranger telling me to go back to Kokiri Forest. I had to see what was wrong with that mountain, and that meant going to the Fire Temple first. I think a lot of it comes down to the mindset I was in at the time, but I think that this sequence break is reasonable for a few other reasons.
As it stands, the intended sequence of events after getting the Master Sword goes like this.
First, go to Kakariko Village's graveyard and race the ghost of the gravekeeper named Dompe for his stretching, shrinking keepsake, the hook shot, a sort of spring-loaded grappling hook that becomes a vital tool in Link's arsenal. Then go back to Kokiri Forest, back through the Lost Woods, and arrive at the Sacred Forest Meadow, the place where Link's green-haired bestie taught him her song. Sacred Forest Meadow, at some point in the 7 years that Link was gone, has become the site of a truly irritating stealth sequence involving a classic Legend of Zelda enemy, moblins, large humanoids with pig-like features who patrol the area and charge at Link with their spears if they see him. This section isn't difficult, but it is tedious. Success is mostly a matter of patiently waiting for a moblin to pass by, and then getting a quick jab in while he's facing away from you. Not helping matters is the visual design of the moblins. It's not just that I find this iteration of their design to be bland and unappealing, though that is true. What is more problematic is that their design fails to communicate how they work. While they charge, they're invulnerable. The most direct comparison here is the Poe sisters found in the Forest Temple, who also have a charging attack that makes them invulnerable. Now, those fights, at least the first 3, are tedious as well, and their limited periods of vulnerability are a big part of why. But their invulnerability is properly signaled. They disappear, such that attacks pass right through them, or they spin their torch around to deflect attacks. attacks. It makes sense visually. Not so with the moblins, who simply hold their spear at their waist in a way that somehow defends them from being struck in the head. But then, when they're vulnerable, they go down with a single swipe from Link's sword, a single bomb, or a single poke from the hookshot, which, convenient as it may be, is a strange sight with a large imposing monster like this. After sneaking past a few spear-wielding moblins, you're rewarded with another moblin, this one wielding a club. He strikes the ground, sending out a shockwave in a straight line that sends Link flying quite a distance back if he gets hit. This enemy's animation communicates a bit more clearly, but this encounter is still a huge hassle, requiring precise strafing movements that the controls are ill-equipped to produce. And, for no reason in particular, the club-wielding moblin requires multiple strikes to defeat, unlike his spear-wielding friends. Once you've gotten past him, you arrive at the entrance to the forest temple, which you can't reach without using the hookshot.
Even setting aside the specifics of what makes the Sacred Forest Meadow stealth sequence frustrating, it occupies a strange place in Ocarina of Time's structure. Ocarina of Time's dungeons always involve some kind of overworld task to access. Getting the sword and shield in Kokiri Forest, finding Ruto's note to show to King Zora, that kind of thing. Getting to the forest temple requires doing two unrelated tasks, obtaining the hookshot and sneaking past the moblins.
This isn't necessarily a problem, but it does feel strange when one considers that accessing the fire temple doesn't really involve much of a task at all. You arrive at Goron City to find it empty, except for a small Goron rolling around in a circle. You have to lay out bomb to stop his rolling, at which point he reveals that the Gorons of the city have been captured and imprisoned in the fire temple, and are going to be fed to the dragon, Volvagia. He also reveals in the game's most adorable twist that his father named him after Link. He gives Link the Goron tunic, which allows him to endure the heat of Death Mountain Crater and access the fire temple. And that's it. To me, it makes more sense to get the hookshot from Kakariko Graveyard and then head straight up Death Mountain to get to the fire temple. In other words, treating the graveyard race with Dom Pei as if it was the overworld task for the fire temple, and then treating sneaking past the moblins as the task for the forest temple.
The fire temple can easily be completed before the forest temple, and I think it's more satisfying to do it in that order for a variety of reasons.
There are some narrative reasons I've already discussed. Seeing Death Mountain off in the distance after leaving the Temple of Time would seem to me to be a strong motivator to head in that direction, especially considering that you need to head that way anyway to get the hookshot. And then there is the strong narrative component of the dungeon itself. Narrative elements mostly absent in the Forest Temple. Sure, hunting down the Poe sisters in the Forest Temple isn't nothing, but rescuing the Gorons throughout the Fire Temple gives nice regular doses of heroism dopamine that does a good job re-establishing Link's role as a savior, even in the ruined Hyrule. On that same note, consider the two dungeons' boss fights. The Fire Temple ends with a fight against a dragon, a strong, classical kind of image that shows what this new adult Link is capable of. Then, Link proceeds through the Forest Temple and meets Phantom Ganon. His mockery of Link hits harder when he has something to tear down, instead of coming in at his lowest moment. Plus, doing the Forest Temple after the Fire Temple means that Ganondorf's appearances are spread out a little more evenly, making him feel like more of a looming presence rather than a figure who shows up at only the beginning and end of the game. The Fire Temple also does a better job establishing Link's new goal of finding the 6 sages and what it means for someone to be a sage. With the Forest Temple, you are merely told that Link's green-haired bestie, Saria, went inside to investigate, only actually seeing her at the very end after she has become a sage. In the Fire Temple, Darunia greets Link early on, impressed with how much he's grown, and then goes on to challenge the the dragon Volvagia. It's a fight Darunia knows he'll lose, as he lacks the legendary Megaton Hammer that is required to defeat Volvagia. This is the clearest demonstration the game offers of the implication that someone has to die to become a sage. The other 4 temples handle this in more vague and confusing ways, so it's important that the player's baseline understanding of the sages is informed by Darunia in the Fire Temple, rather than Saria in the Forest Temple.
The Fire Temple provides some good narrative context for the rest of the game, or at least it's equally as good of a choice as the Forest Temple. Why then does the game specifically point the player in the direction of the Forest Temple?
It seems to me that it's an attempt to create narrative parallels between the dungeons Link goes through as a child and those he goes through as an adult. He deals with the Kokiri, then the Gorons, and then the Zora, in that exact order. And I just don't think those parallels are especially compelling. At least, not compelling enough to give the Forest Temple priority over the Fire Temple. Moreover, I think the Fire Temple is a better mechanical introduction to adult Link's adventure than the Forest Temple, but I'm going to have to go into much greater depth than I did when talking about the narrative in order to explain why. As I mentioned earlier, both the Forest Temple and the Fire Temple introduce a narrative thread early on that the player will follow throughout the dungeon. In both cases, the narrative thread is used to establish some central mechanic to the dungeon. In the Forest Temple, the 4 Poe sisters steal the flames from 4 torches in the hub room, which disables the elevator to the boss's chamber. The player needs to hunt them down to reclaim the flames and fix the elevator. In the Fire Temple, the player needs to rescue Gorons who've been imprisoned to be sacrificed to the dragon Volvagia. The captured Gorons have a clearer and more consistent role in the dungeon than the Poe sisters do. All 4 of the Poe sisters have a flame you need to recover, but the first 2 have additional rewards, a key and a compass. It's one of a handful of inconsistencies in the Forest Temple. By contrast, every time the player rescues a Goron, they're rewarded with a key and a hint. Unlike the lopsided pacing of the Poe sisters fights, where the player spends the entire first half of the dungeon without encountering any of them before fighting all 4 of them in rapid succession, the 9 Gorons the player rescues in the Fire Temple are all spaced out fairly regularly. This also ties into why the Fire Temple is an effective introduction to keys and how they affect the flow of a dungeon. Because all 9 of the keys in the Fire Temple are found alongside a Goron, their placement is a bit more predictable and can be foreshadowed. For example, the player can see the ostentatious blue and gold treasure chest containing the boss key right from the start, even though it's unattainable until the very end. Unlike the haphazard placement of keys in the Forest Temple, the connection to rescuing Gorons makes every key in the Fire Temple just a little bit memorable, which is helpful when there are so many of them, more than any other dungeon in any of the 3-dimensional games in the series even. Locks and keys are placed very deliberately in the Fire Temple, and their placement is critical to its overall exploration challenge.
To illustrate what I mean by this, I'm going to split the Fire Temple up into 5 acts. Act 1 is very brief and consists of the first 3 rooms that the player has access to. They make a strong first impression.
We'll start with the entrance room. It appears to be a natural cave adorned with hand-carved stone fixtures. A staircase splits the room into 2 levels. Right away, the player's attention will be drawn upstairs to the statues at the back of the room. 3 faces with flames in their wide, open mouths. The dungeons in Ocarina of Time are stages built to facilitate gameplay or broad emotional impressions far more than they are supposed to be representative of any real kind of environment or building. Still, this first room of the Fire Temple has some ephemeral quality to it that does suggest a religious purpose. It's not just that the statues are present, but also the way they sit in such a strong position in the center of the room, raised up on a higher platform, with their bright flames and their dark brown bodies contrasting against the softer, duller colors of the room around them. The entrance room connects to 4 other rooms, with 2 doors on the lower level, 1 on each side of the staircase, and 2 doors on the upper level leading to the western and eastern halves of the dungeon. The door on the right side of the staircase is blocked by a statue. The door on the left side of the staircase leads to a small hallway containing a Goron's cell, but the switch that unlocks it is inaccessible, and so is, by extension, the aforementioned ostentatious blue and gold treasure chest inside the cell, which contains the boss key. The door on the eastern side of the upper level needs to be unlocked with a key, while the door on the western side is unlocked and leads to a red-hot room where Link reunites with his sworn brother, Darunia, who tells Link about the legendary Megaton Hammer before leaving for his doomed fight against the dungeon's boss. This red-hot room is where the player rescues their first Goron and, by extension, gains their first key, used to unlock the door on the eastern side of the upper level of the first room. When the player unlocks that door, that marks the end of the dungeon's first act. This is kind of a hashtag game design video essay thing to point out, but it's worth mentioning. These 3 rooms introduce, in microcosm, the concept for the rest of the dungeon. See Gorons suffering in prison, free them if you can, then proceed with keys in hand. Combined with the enticing sight of both the boss key treasure chest and the locked door to the boss's chamber, both just barely out of reach. These rooms give the player a clear idea of what their goals are, and a general idea of how to accomplish them. Also important is how strongly composed these rooms are. I've already talked about the entrance and its suggestion of religious architecture, but it's not just aesthetically compelling, it's also a compelling case of visual communication. If my description of the entrance and all the rooms it connected to seemed complex, don't worry, because the space itself is easy to understand when you're looking at it. All the important details are arranged so that they're visible at the same time when the player enters the dungeon, but it doesn't sacrifice a sense of scale, as there's plenty of empty space to run around in, and the pillars in the 4 corners of the room stretch high, well above the player's normal line of sight. This great big entrance room makes for an especially good contrast, then, with the cramped hallway containing the Goron jail cell and the treasure chest with the boss key. Of course, the visual communication here in this straight hallway is dead simple. What about the aesthetics, though? Here, the muted earth tones of the entrance room become darker and harsher. The torches in the entrance room cast it in a soft, warm light, but in this jail cell hallway, they cast thick, unsettling shadows. Between the constricted space and the darker color palette, it's easy to understand why the Goron prisoner is curled up into a ball and shivering, and it's all the more heartbreaking that you have to leave him here until the very end of the dungeon. And then, by extension, all the more empowering when you leap across the stonework in the red-hot room to the west of the entrance and rescue your first Goron. Like the entrance room, this western room is easy to take in at a glance. Understanding the room is not the challenge here. Some simple platforming is. The platforms aren't fully aligned, and you have to jump off the edges at a slight angle to get from one to the other. Link's platforming skills are insufficient to carry him to the platform where the exit to the boss's chamber is, however. It remains out of reach until the player finds a way to create a new platform to bridge the gap, but that won't happen until the Fire Temple's 5th act. That is how the room functions in a gameplay sense. Aesthetically, the western room is a continuation of the religious architecture of the entrance room, but given a more sinister edge by the red-hot glow of the lava underneath. The stonework is much more angular and intrusive here, clearly set apart from the natural cave environment. The entrance room is serene, existing in harmony with the cave that it's built into. The red-hot western room feels much more harsh and violent, which is appropriate. After all, this is the last room that living sacrifices are shepherded through before being fed to a dragon.
Anyway, that's all I can really squeeze out of the 3 rooms that comprise Act 1. Between their strong aesthetics and the way they set up the mechanics of the rest of the dungeon, this brief act is a compelling introduction to the Fire Temple. We proceed through the eastern exit of the entrance room, unlocking a door and entering Act 2.
This is a large room with a lot going on. There's a wooden bridge suspended precariously over a lake of lava with little misshapen bits of terrain sticking out, as well as platforms that sink when you stand on them, platforms that shoot up when you stand on them, and platforms that slide around propelled by jets of fire. And then, of course, there are the flaming skulls which ambush the player by leaping out of the lava lake. This room's large space is used to create a feeling of hostility and chaos, and suggest a section of the temple that has either been ruined or was abandoned in the middle of its construction. The wooden bridge is an obvious straight line running from the west to the east across this room, but it ends at a locked door, so you have to hunt around the north and south of this large room to find a key. Act 2 offers a good illustration of a concept I internally refer to as key discipline. I alluded to it earlier when talking about the forest temple, but I think it's easier to explain with regards to the fire temple. In this room, the north and south exits both contain keys, so there are 2 keys available before you unlock the eastern exit. If you get one key and then immediately head to the eastern exit, eager to see what lies beyond the locked door, you'll have to deal with this entire puzzle where you climb up a fence to push a block onto a jet of flame to create a makeshift elevator before encountering your next locked door, at which point you have to backtrack, get the second key, and then do all the fence climbing again in order to proceed. Your impatience is punished with tedium. So, the most efficient method is to get as many keys as you can before unlocking any doors, and that is not just the case in the Fire Temple and Ocarina of Time. This approach is effective across every dungeon in the series. Key discipline is a way of keeping the amount of space in a dungeon manageable and reducing the necessity of backtracking. Act 1 of the Fire Temple consists of the 3 rooms available to the player before using the dungeon's first key. Act 2 consists of the rooms available to the player before using the dungeon's second and third keys. Act 2's space is bigger than Act 1's, but only slightly. Just like Act 1, it feels very contained. Now, I think a lot of people who talk about game design would say that Act 2 of the Fire Temple teaches the player the key discipline that is so important for the rest of the dungeons. But I don't think that's exactly the case, because I don't entirely subscribe to the idea that game design alone can teach people things any more than a page of a book can teach someone how to read. Learning is a complex process that requires communication, and while game design is a form of communication, simply being able to progress in a game doesn't necessarily mean that the communication has happened successfully.
Case in point, I've beaten every Legend of Zelda game, many of them more than once, before it ever occurred to me that I should approach the locks and keys like this. I was prone to impulsively using my keys as soon as I could, and it was only after watching the YouTuber Mark Brown's video series, Boss Keys, that I realized what my mistake was. No amount of game design was going to teach my padded ass how to manage these dungeons, not without some assistance from a British guy's YouTube videos at least.
This is not to say that a sufficiently observant player wouldn't be able to learn things just from examining this dungeon's design, and indeed, I think the contained space of Act 2 of the Fire Temple provides a good opportunity to do so. Certainly, I think it provides a better opportunity than the sprawling, overwhelming Forest Temple does. Exploring and navigating the Fire Temple is much simpler than the Forest Temple. Rooms are often based around simple platforming challenges that can be easily intuited at a glance, even if they may have traps or surprises along the way. The big chaotic room at the center of Act 2 is a great example of this. There are a lot of moving parts, but they don't serve to make the room more confusing to explore, just more exciting to navigate. The Fire Temple in general is more focused on platforming than the rest of the dungeons in Ocarina of Time, and it creates an exciting, adventurous feeling. At least it creates this feeling assuming the player is able to go through without stumbling too much. Needing to backtrack because you unlocked the door before you've gathered both of the keys in Act 2 is a minor stumble, but starting with Act 3, the Fire Temple starts to introduce much more irritating stumbling blocks. Act 3 begins with the player facing, for a second time, a trembling Goron who they can't save yet. Nothing to do but solve another puzzle involving vertical navigation and pushing blocks. The room is somewhat forgettable, which I say not from a position of critical distance, but because I literally forgot about this room as I was writing this section of the essay. Maybe it's because it feels a little redundant to have two rooms centered around vertical ascent right up next to each other, but the redundancy runs deeper than that, in a way that I'll explain later on. More memorable is what comes next, a maze-like room filled with boulders rolling in bizarre, unpredictable patterns. The camera zooms out and takes on an overhead view, which makes the boulders more visible, but the change in perspective mostly serves to make the room more confusing, making doors harder to see, and making it more difficult to orient yourself, especially considering that you get the map and compass soon after dealing with this room. This room, like the big chaotic lava lake room from Act 2, contains a locked door and 2 keys, the 4th and 5th keys in the dungeon. The challenge of avoiding the boulders and making your way through the maze is simultaneously simpler and more confusing than it was in that previous room, not to mention more irritating and less visually interesting. Unless you find eye strain visually interesting, in which case you will love this maze's sickly yellow tiles and rotating camera, which gives the whole thing the feeling of being inside a giant smoke-stained disco ball. When you've collected both of the keys from the room with the rolling boulders, you proceed to the tiny room that connects Act 3 to Act 4. Now, this room is one of my favorite and least favorite parts of Ocarina of Time. It's a circular room consisting of a narrow, jagged walkway over a deep pit. Note that I said deep, but not bottomless. When Link falls down a bottomless pit, he reappears at the room's entrance, having taken a little bit of damage. If Link slips up in this room, however, the punishment is much harsher. This pit connects back to the chaotic lava lake room from Act 2, meaning that the player will have to go back through the room with the makeshift elevator, back through the unmemorable room, and back through the room with the rolling boulders. It's a really nasty punishment for an unsuspecting player.
But I am not an unsuspecting player. Not only do I have lots of experience with this game, I also had the foresight to play it not on my physical copy, but on an emulator, where I can use save states to rewind whatever mistakes I make. Playing Ocarina of Time like this isn't authentic in the sense that it doesn't recreate the experience of playing it in 1998, but it does allow me to better appreciate certain aspects of the game without the threat of profound annoyance.
When you fall from this tiny room with the pit into the chaotic room with the lava lake, it shows that the rooms are not separate entities floating in space, but parts of an interconnected whole. It makes the fire temple feel so much more real, more impressive, and more dangerous. It's not just its connection to a previous room that I find interesting. Something about this small circular room just charms me. Add it to the list of rooms that I think about when I think about Ocarina of Time. The precarious walkway isn't an entirely natural formation. It's topped with tiled stone. Maybe the builders didn't reinforce the floor enough, and chunks fell into the lake of lava below. This tiny room with the pit exhibits a quality that is so hard to define. It gets my imagination going. Even with its attendant annoyances, I think it's a strong end to Act 3. Act 4 begins with a fun set piece of a room where the player is chased by a wall of fire as they run and jump across metal scaffolding, with some flaming skulls ready to ambush the player for a little extra excitement. Unfortunately, Act 4 also forces the player to return to the rolling boulder maze room, this time on a higher level. The threat of falling back down to the lower level of the maze is ever present, at which which point the player will have to run back through the maze, go back through the tiny room with the pit, and again outrun the wall of fire. And, of course, the threat of the pit is ever looming, ready to turn the medium-sized annoyance of a decent amount of backtracking into the gigantic annoyance of an unconscionable amount of backtracking. Again, you have access to 2 keys at this point. The 6th key is obtained by rescuing a Goron on the upper level of the maze. The 7th key is obtained by bombing this interesting looking crack in the floor and climbing back down into the unmemorable room, where you can now rescue the Goron that you saw earlier. With these 2 keys in hand, you can proceed to the final room of Act 4. This room, with its Pac-Man-esque shape, is filled with firewalls that only appear when you get close. If you are running and see a firewall pop up in front of you, it's likely too late to react in time. The challenge is not, however, to trudge through at a snail's pace. Flaming bats, spinning flamethrowers, and rolling boulders team up to keep Link moving around frantically. The navigation challenge requires the player to keep track of an array of moving parts, while understanding that Link's movement doesn't start and stop on a dime. He has inertia and a slight turning radius. It's all a bit much, and I can't say I've ever gotten comfortable navigating this room with any sort of skill. Nothing in here does much damage, giving plenty of leeway for mistakes, for better or for worse. Still, I think the way it combines elements to create a frantic set piece is compelling, even if it ends up feeling either frustrating or comedic, depending on my mood. The second key of Act 4 grants access to another part of this same room, so that's where Act 5 begins. Really, though, Act 5 properly begins in the next room, where the player takes on the Flare Dancer mini-boss. I like the audio-visual design of this enemy, a humanoid figure made of orange flame that cackles menacingly as it skates around its donut-shaped arena. Pull out the small black core in this figure's chest, however, and the flames are extinguished, the core sprouting tiny legs and skittering away from the player with a high-pitched whimper. After taking a bit of damage, the core then reignites, this time wreathed in purple flame. Then, after another cycle, reignites with a green flame. The fight itself is mildly tedious. The guy just takes a few too many hits to go down. It wouldn't be as much of a problem if you didn't have to fight a second Flare Dancer towards the end of Act 5. It's just enough to knock a decent mini-boss fight down a peg to mediocre. Still, not as tedious as the mini-bosses in the Forest Temple, but what does it say that almost every single dungeon in this game has an example of this kind of repetition? Anyway, after this first Flare Dancer is defeated, the player is taken on an elevator ride to a room with a repeat of the puzzles seen in the unmemorable room. Repeating this challenge was already a strange choice to begin with, but this version is actually slightly simpler than the already simple challenge seen in the unmemorable room. With that out of the way, the player arrives at the peak of the dungeon, the 5th floor, in a large circular room. It's here that Link obtains the legendary Megaton Hammer. Well, assuming he can complete a platforming challenge where he has to run up a narrow circular staircase within a limited time without falling down into the big pit at the center of the room. Unfortunately, we see the return of the concept of a deep but not bottomless pit, and so failing at this platforming challenge forces the player to retrace their steps before retrying. Again, speaking as someone who emulated this game and made ample use of save states, I'm able to appreciate the sense of spatial continuity, but run up a staircase carefully just doesn't feel like a compelling enough challenge to justify such an annoying punishment. I'm tempted to say that the challenge should have been completely changed to remove this punishment. Move the challenge to the outer edge of the room somehow. Let the spatial continuity just be an Easter egg, a funny connection the player can discover if they decide to hop in that big, inviting-looking pit off in the center of the room. But I'm also also tempted to say that such a change might weaken the emotional effect of the dungeon. Put a pin in that. I'll explain in a moment. After getting the Megaton Hammer, the player is given a few places to test it out. They hit a raised tile and fall into a new room, where they can smash a statue to reveal a door. They enter into a room where they hit a tile to form a staircase, a neat effect that is used exactly one time, in this room and this room only. The real puzzle of this room is realizing that these unassuming wooden boxes aren't supposed to be destroyed like most destructible objects in this game, but are instead supposed to be used to weigh down a switch at the bottom of the staircase to unlock the door to the next room. Anyway, a few smacks of the hammer later, and the player has rescued their 8th Goron and gotten their 8th key, the final normal key of the dungeon. Now, the only place left to go is back to the beginning of the dungeon, and in order to do so, you have to make peace with your old enemy, the spatial continuity of the Fire Temple. Smack the hammer into the top of this square pillar, and you find yourself falling down into the room where you met Darunia, all the way back in Act 1 of the dungeon. I distinctly remember that the first time I did this, when I was 7 years old, I felt my heart sink. I was certain I had done something wrong. The first 2 times I had fallen to an earlier portion of the dungeon, it was a punishment. This time, however, I had fallen right to where I needed to be, a twist ending to a narrative arc that you didn't even realize was there. Dropping the pillar from up above creates a path to the boss door. Now, all you need is the boss key. Megaton Hammer in hand, you can finally go back to the entrance room, destroy the statue blocking the door on the east side of the bottom of the staircase, fight the Flare Dancer a second time, and finally rescue the trembling Goron you couldn't save at the beginning of the dungeon, and obtain the boss key. The only thing left in the Fire Temple is the boss, the subterranean lava dragon with the cunty name, Volvagia. The room is thick with an oppressive red haze. This is the hottest spot in the volcano for sure. The platform the fight takes place on is marked with a strange 3x3 grid of small lava pits, each one maybe half a meter in diameter. The long body of Volvagia snakes its way through the air and then dives into one of the lava pits before re-emerging, stuck and ready to be hit with the Megaton Hammer. A few hits later and it shakes itself loose, flying through the sky and raining down fire and boulders on Link before diving back down into a new lava pit, emerging from another one only to get hit with the hammer again. The Legend of Zelda series has a knack for mixing silly and cool, and what better example is there than this, a dragon that you slay through a game of whack-a-mole.
Now, with all the ups and downs I listed, can I really still confidently say the Fire Temple is a better introduction to this portion of the game than the Forest Temple? They both end up being mixed bags after all. And while the Fire Temple is arguably easier, it is, well, arguable. Someone who ends up falling into those not bottomless pits too many times would probably prefer the more compact design of the Forest Temple, even if it is more convoluted. Well, I'm sorry to say that I don't have a conclusive answer. Subjectivity strikes again. I just wish the game was a bit more flexible and was more willing to acknowledge completing the Fire Temple first as a valid choice.
The biggest difference between the difficulty of the Fire Temple and the difficulty of the Forest Temple is hard to pin down, and it largely comes down to a thought that I keep having as I prod at this game and write this essay. Video games in general, and Ocarina of Time's dungeons specifically, aren't just what's happening in the video game console and what's playing on the screen and out of the speakers. These dungeons happen inside your brain. Both the Fire Temple and the Forest Temple are large spaces, but in much the same way that Dodongo's Cavern's large space belies the fact that the path through it is pretty straightforward, the Fire Temple is a space that is easy to compress inside your brain. The Fire Temple features a mix of hallways, rooms with multiple exits where every exit is clearly visible from any point in the room, and rooms that are internally complex but still essentially have one entrance and one exit. The big chaotic lava lake room for example, has an entrance, an exit, and 2 side rooms. But those side rooms are quick excursions that can be safely discarded from memory. The second you go into one of those small rooms housing a Goron jail cell, you know you won't have to go back. This is why I felt the need to split the dungeon up into 5 acts. There is a clear sense of progression the whole way through, and it's easy to understand that as long as you're diligent about collecting keys, once you have left a room, you're mostly done dealing with it. Rather than being a part of the process of exploration and information gathering, backtracking in the Fire Temple is usually used as a punishment for missing certain jumps, like I discussed earlier with the tiny room with the pit and the upper level of the room with the rolling boulders. When the dungeon does require backtracking, it usually points you in the direction you're supposed to go. So, for example, while it may be annoying to fall into the pit in the Megaton Hammer room, you actually land right in the room where you are supposed to go after getting the hammer. After obtaining the hammer and going through a few rooms to test it out, you are dropped right in front of the door to the room that you had fallen into previously. Now, the game doesn't prevent you from making mistakes that would then require backtracking, but it does do a lot of work to show you the way forward. It is a bunch of subtle design differences that come together to create a tangible difference in feeling. The Fire Temple feels less complex than the Forest Temple, and I can't point to things like number of rooms or number of locked doors to express where this difference comes from, because the difficulty of Ocarina of Time swings in some weird ways, like how the Forest Temple is harder than the Fire Temple, which is then followed by the much more challenging Water Temple, which is then followed by the super straightforward Shadow Temple. One might be tempted to say that the designers were simply careless. Certainly, the game has some pacing and structural problems, but the dungeons themselves, as isolated experiences, are usually carefully crafted with a clear understanding of player psychology. As simple as the combat and puzzles may be, as irritating as many sequences are, Ocarina of Time's dungeons feel satisfying on the whole because they all create subtly different kinds of satisfaction. The Forest Temple seems mysterious and spooky, and ends up being suitably confusing, so completing it feels like a real accomplishment. The Fire Temple is big and imposing, but is surprisingly simple to complete, which is satisfying in a different kind of way, like getting into a fight with a guy who's 2 feet taller than you and knocking him out in one swing. This has never and will never happen to me, but if it has happened to you, sound off in the comments about how satisfying it was.
My favorite example, though, of what I mean when I talk about player psychology and how the dungeons exist just as much in the player's brain as they do in the game itself comes not from one of the 9 main dungeons, but from one of the several mini dungeons. I discussed Gerudo Fortress earlier, and I'll give the Ice Cavern its due later, but right now I would like to pay my respects to the bottom of the well.